There is a scroll sitting in a library in Naples that has not been read by human eyes since the year 79 AD. The day it was last opened, a mountain was about to end the world as its readers knew it, and the words on that scroll, sealed shut by volcanic heat for nearly 2,000 years, are now being read again, not by scholars with magnifying glasses, not by archaeologists with forceps, but by a machine that taught itself to see ink inside a lump of charcoal without ever touching it. That is not a metaphor. That is exactly what happened. Think about what it takes to make something unreadable forever. You need heat intense enough to incinerate paper, but not quite enough to turn it to ash, a narrow, almost impossible window of destruction. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, the villa of the Papyri was hit by a blast of hot gas and ash, reaching around 600 degrees Fahrenheit, which instantly carbonized the papyrus scrolls, transforming them into charred, cylindrical lumps. And then here is the cruel part, that same process preserved them. The volcano destroyed these scrolls, and saved them at the same time. It was the most precise act of accidental archiving in all of human history. Deep within a sprawling, ultra-luxury estate, known today as the Villa of the Papyri, that superheated volcanic material baked a private library of over 1,800 papyrus scrolls into fragile chunks of charcoal, preserving the only intact library ever recovered from classical antiquity. The only one. There is no second place. In 1752, well diggers tunneling through the deeply buried ruins of Herculaneum broke through a series of small rooms. They found walls lined with built-in wooden cabinets, packed with what looked like blackened, charred sticks of firewood or rolls of briquettes. Workers initially threw some of them away, burned them as fuel, tossed ancient text into fires to keep warm, not knowing what they held. By the time scholars realized what the collection was, untold numbers of scrolls had already been destroyed a second time, this time by human hands. The ones that survived came from a villa historians strongly believe belonged to Lucius Calpurnius Piso Cessaninus, a wealthy Roman politician, consul, and the father-in-law of Julius Caesar. This was not a public library. This was a private reading room at the highest level of Roman society, stocked with the most sophisticated intellectual texts of the ancient world. The papyri contain a number of Greek philosophical texts and come from the only surviving library from antiquity that exists in its entirety. That means everything you have ever read about what ancient Greece and Rome thought, believed, debated, and wrote, all of it is filtered through manuscripts that were copied and recopied across the centuries, often by medieval monks who changed words, dropped passages, added their own theology. But these scrolls were written in the 1st century BC and sealed in volcanic rock before anyone could edit them. What is inside them is the raw, unfiltered record. Whatever those scrolls say, it has not passed through a single set of human hands since the empire was still standing. And for nearly 2,000 years, no one could read a single word of them. Here is why. After surviving the volcanic eruption in AD 79, the Herculaneum scrolls are extremely fragile and crumble if taken apart. Scholars tried. For 2.5 centuries, some of the best minds in European academia attempted to unroll these things by hand. The results were catastrophic. Various attempts to physically unroll the scrolls were unsuccessful, resulting in only fragments being recovered. Every time someone tried to open one, pieces flaked off, cracked apart, fell to powder. You would get a few letters, maybe a partial line, and the rest would be gone forever. The scrolls resisted every human attempt to read them, as if the volcano's work was not finished, as if something did not want these words read. Now, let's talk about what changed. In 2006, a computer scientist at the University of Kentucky named Brent Seales started asking a different question. Not, how do we unroll this? But, how do we read it without ever touching it? This breakthrough follows more than 20 years of work by Seales and a team of researchers at the University of Kentucky. They developed non-invasive technologies to access text locked deep within the compacted, carbonized layers of the Herculaneum papyri. The idea was to feed the scrolls into a CT scanner, the same kind hospitals use to look inside a human body. Build a three-dimensional map of every layer of papyrus compressed inside the lump, and then computationally unfold that map into a flat, readable surface. Virtually unwrap it. Open the scroll without opening the scroll. The concept was elegant. The execution was, for a long time, nearly impossible. Their work went on to show that the elusive carbon ink of the Herculaneum scrolls could also be detected using X-ray tomography, laying the foundation for what would eventually become the Vesuvius challenge. But here is the specific problem that almost stopped everything. The ink used on these scrolls is carbon-based. Most ancient inks contain metal lead, copper, iron, and those metals show up brilliantly under X-ray because they are denser than the surrounding material. But carbon ink has almost exactly the same density as carbonized papyrus. Black writing on black paper, invisible to the machine, hiding in plain sight inside the scan. Every layer of papyrus looked the same. For years, the data showed the scroll perfectly, and it showed the ink as nothing. That is where artificial intelligence entered the room. In 2023, Nat Friedman, Daniel Gross, and computer scientist Brent Seales announced the Vesuvius Challenge, a global competition to decipher Herculaneum scrolls using 3D X-ray software. The Vesuvius Challenge offered a $700,000 grand prize to the first team that could extract 4 passages of text from 2 intact scrolls using 3D X-ray scans. They released the scan data publicly. They released the tools publicly. They invited the entire world to try. What they got back exceeded anything they had anticipated. As part of what they called the Vesuvius Challenge, they released their AI program along with thousands of 3D X-ray images of 2 rolled-up scrolls and 3 papyrus fragments. Researchers, students, programmers, and amateur coders from dozens of countries downloaded the data and started training machine learning models to detect the almost invisible difference in the way carbon ink reflected X-ray light against the carbon papyrus. Background: the difference was so subtle no human eye could perceive it, but a neural network, trained on thousands of examples of what ink might look like, trained to find patterns no one had thought to look for, started finding something. While difficult to see with the human eye, AI was able to classify dark channels as letters. And then one night, in October 2023, it happened. On the 12th of October 2023, the project awarded $40,000 to Luke Fariter, a 2-1-year-old computer science student at the University of Nebraska, for successfully detecting the first word in an unopened scroll, porphyras, ancient Greek for purple, 1 word, 13 letters, inside a lump of charcoal that had not been read in nearly 2,000 years. That single word, pulled from the void, confirmed the entire approach worked. The scroll could be read. The ink was there. The text had survived. But the competition had only begun. If that alone is hard to take in, what came next is where this story shifts into territory that no one in classical scholarship had expected in their lifetime. Youssef Nada, an Egyptian biorobotics graduate student in Berlin, led the winning team that also included Luke Fariter and Julian Schilliger, a robotics student from Zurich. 3 students, different countries, different fields, none of them professional classicists or archaeologists. They had never physically seen the scrolls. They worked from scan data on computers, and by early 2024, their AI models revealed 2,000 characters in 4 full columns, far outstripping the grand prize criterion of 4 passages of 140 characters. In early February 2024, the Vesuvius Challenge awarded them the $700,000 grand prize, 2,000 characters, 4 complete columns of text. From a scroll that has been sealed since the Roman Empire was at its height. And here is what those characters said. The winners of the contest trained their machine learning algorithms on scans of the rolled-up papyrus, unveiling a previously unknown philosophical work that discusses the senses and pleasure. It is a previously unread tract, probably by Philodemus, about pleasure. Are good things in small quantities more delightful than copious good things? Not at all, the author concludes. A 2,000-year-old philosopher writing inside a scroll that a volcano tried to destroy, making an argument about pleasure and abundance. And the first thing the modern world heard him say, after 19 centuries of silence, was that more of a good thing is not worse than a little of it. The ancient world's version of an argument you might have at dinner. It is almost disarming. You expect the first message from antiquity to be profound, cosmic, a revelation. Instead, it is a philosopher making a perfectly human point about enjoyment, which, in its own way, is the most human thing possible. But understand what this text actually represents. As many as 44 works discovered in the collection were written by the 1st century BC Epicurean philosopher and poet Philodemus, a resident of Herculaneum who possibly formed the library, or whose library was incorporated into it. Philodemus's library contained extensive, previously lost treatises on music, poetry, rhetoric, and death, all aiming to teach humans how to live a life free from the paralyzing fear of the gods and supernatural intervention. This was radical thinking. In a world where the state religion, the emperors, the institutions all demanded piety and obedience to the divine order, Philodemus was writing a philosophy of liberation from exactly that. A philosophy that said, the supernatural has no claim on you, that fear of death is irrational, that pleasure and peace of mind are the highest human goals. Those texts were buried in a volcano. And the institution that was most invested in fear of the supernatural, the Church, controlled European scholarship for more than 1,000 years after that. Coincidence? Possibly. But the timing, as they say, is interesting, and here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because the story does not end with Philodemus and pleasure. The Stoic philosopher Chrysippus is attested to have written over 700 works, all of them lost, with the exception of a few fragments quoted by other authors. 700 works, gone. Chrysippus was considered by many ancient sources to be the second founder of Stoicism, the philosophy that gave us the concepts of living according to reason, of the universal brotherhood of humanity, of the logos, the rational principle underlying all existence. 700 texts from one of the most influential thinkers in Western history, and we have fragments, quotes inside other people's quotes, because the originals burned, were lost, were never copied. Segments of his works on providence and logical questions were found among the papyri of Herculaneum. They are in there, somewhere inside those lumps of charcoal in a library in Naples. There may also be lost works by Aristotle, Livy, a Homeric epic, or poems by Sappho. The complete works of Sappho, the greatest lyric poet of the ancient world, a writer so admired that Plato reportedly called her the 10th muse, survive in fragments today. Partial lines, pieces of stanzas. The rest is gone, but if even one of those carbonized scrolls in the Villa of the Papyri contains a copy of her work, what has been lost for more than 2 millennia could come back. As one scholar put it, some of these texts could completely rewrite the history of key periods of the ancient world. That is not a YouTube channel making a claim. That is a classical scholar talking to Bloomberg. Now consider what the AI has already found, beyond the pleasure text. This is where the story takes a turn that even the researchers themselves did not expect. On the 23rd of April, 2024, the Institute of Heritage Science of the Italian Academic Council reported that the deciphering of the Herculaneum Papyrus had revealed Plato's burial site. Let that land. For over 2,000 years, the precise location of Plato's grave was unknown. It was only known that Plato was laid to rest inside the Academy, the school he founded outside Athens's city walls around 387 BCE. But where exactly? Which part of the grounds? That detail had been lost, until now. With the aid of what researchers call a bionic eye, a team was recently able to read about 30% more of one of the Herculaneum papyri, leading to several notable discoveries, including the location of Plato's tomb. Some of the fragments belong to a scroll containing a work called The History of the Academy, by the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus of Gadara. In this work, Philodemus offered details about the life of Plato, including that he had been buried in a private garden reserved for the Platonic school of the Academy in Athens, near a small shrine sacred to the Muses. A private garden, near a shrine to the Muses. That is where Plato is buried. And we know that because a man named Philodemus wrote it down in the 1st century BC in a private library on the coast of Italy. A volcano buried it in rock. It sat there for 19 centuries, and an AI model trained by graduate students with no institutional backing found it inside a CT scan. The new information has been drawn from the oldest known history of Greek philosophy, Philodemus's Review of the Philosophers, specifically his detailing of Plato's Academy and its development under his successors. Think about how many scholars, over how many centuries, searched for that information in libraries, archives, manuscripts. Think about how many careers were spent trying to piece together the biography of the most famous philosopher in Western history, and the answer was in a charred lump of papyrus that nobody could open, sitting in a library in Naples the whole time. Now lay the data points side by side. 1. The Herculaneum scrolls represent the only large-scale library from the classical world that has survived in its entirety. Every other ancient library, Alexandria, Pergamon, Antioch, gone. This is the last one. 2. The Papyri contain a number of Greek philosophical texts, including works, almost certainly by philosophers, whose writings were otherwise entirely lost, Chrysippus among them, with potentially hundreds of texts still unread inside the collection. 3. Within the first few percent of one scroll, AI has already recovered a previously unknown philosophical text, confirmed the burial location of Plato, and suggested the possible presence of fragments from other entirely lost works. And that is 5%. 5. 4. In 2023, the project went from 0% to 5% of one scroll. The goal for 2024 was to go from 5% of one scroll to 90% of all 4 scanned scrolls, and to lay the foundation to read all 300. 5. The achievement has also fueled debate over whether further excavations should be conducted at the Herculaneum Villa. Scholars are convinced that the villa's main library was never found, and that thousands more scrolls could still be underground. Read that again. What has been recovered, the 1,800 scrolls sitting in Naples, may not even be the primary library. The main collection may still be under the ground, unexcavated, waiting. We have been told, for 200 years, that the ancient world's knowledge was lost, that the Library of Alexandria burned, and with it went the irretrievable wisdom of antiquity. That what survived is all we have, that the gap in the record is permanent and unfillable. That is the official version. That is what the textbooks say, but the data says something else. The data says there is a villa, half excavated, under a modern Italian town, sitting on top of a library that may still contain hundreds or thousands of scrolls that no human has touched or read since the Roman Empire fell. The data says that the first 5% of one scroll has already rewritten what we know about Plato's burial and produced a text that nobody alive had ever read. The data says that machine learning is now capable of finding carbon ink in carbonized papyrus, a problem that was considered essentially unsolvable a decade ago. The official story says the ancient world's knowledge burned. The actual story is that it was buried. And now we have a machine that can read through the rock. Here is the question that nobody in the establishment wants to ask too loudly. If the Villa of the Papyri held a private library belonging to one wealthy Roman politician's household, Julius Caesar's father-in-law, an influential man, but not even the emperor, and that private collection turned out to be the only intact library from all of classical antiquity, then what was in the public libraries? What was in the great collections of Alexandria, of Pergamon, of Rome itself? What did those libraries hold that this private reading room did not? Because what we know of the ancient world is filtered through everything that was copied by hand during the medieval period, and the people doing that copying had an agenda. They preserved what supported the theological and political order. They let the rest go. You are not a conspiracy theorist for noticing that. That is just the history of information control. The majority of classical texts referred to by other classical authors are lost, and there is hope that the continuing work on the library scrolls we'll discover some of these. The scholars say there is hope they will find lost texts. What they have found, so far, in 5% of one scroll, includes an original philosophical work and the location of Plato's tomb. 5% of one scroll. Brent Seales, the computer scientist who spent 20 years building toward this moment, believes reading the entire collection of Herculaneum scrolls is not only possible, but will be the largest discovery from the ancient world to date. The largest discovery from the ancient world, from a man who has spent his career doing the actual technical work. Not a speculator, not a content creator, a computer science professor who looked inside a charred scroll for 20 years and is now saying this is the biggest thing that has ever happened in archaeology. And most people reading the news in 2024 saw a headline about an AI competition, scrolled past it, and went back to whatever they were watching. The astonishing strides forward made with imaging and AI are enabling us to look inside scrolls that have not been read for almost 2,000 years. That is Oxford University's statement, not fringe researchers, not alternative historians. Oxford. What is coming next is the part that nobody can fully see yet. More broadly, the machine learning techniques pioneered by Seales and the Vesuvius challenge contestants could now be used to study other types of hidden text, such as cartonnage, recycled papyri, often used to wrap Egyptian mummies. There are Egyptian mummies in museums around the world whose cartonnage wrappings contain papyrus documents that have never been read, documents that may be older than anything in the Herculaneum collection. The same AI, the same approach, applied to a different context, and suddenly the unreadable becomes readable again. The last 2,000 years of human knowledge has a hole in it, not a small hole, not a gap here and there, a vast, structured absence where an entire civilization's thought used to be philosophy, science, poetry, history, mathematics. The things that were copied survived, the things that weren't vanished, and we built our entire understanding of who the ancient world was, what they knew, what they believed, on the copies of the survivors. But the originals are still there. Under the rock, inside the lumps of charcoal, on the papyrus wrappings of the dead, and the machines are learning to read them. The next question is what else is underground at Herculaneum? The excavation stopped not because there was nothing left, but because there was no reason to keep digging when nothing could be read. Now there is a reason, and what comes up from under that town in the years ahead may not just add chapters to the history of the ancient world, it may rewrite the table of contents entirely. If you want to go deeper into what else is buried under the ground at Herculaneum, not the scrolls, but the buildings, the levels that were never excavated, and what archaeologists believe is still down there, that is exactly what this channel covers next. The scrolls are the words. The structure beneath them is something else entirely.